Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's lunch break. I'm Stephen Freitas with OAAA. And today's topic is perspectives powering out of home with rich data. Joining us today is a great panel. We have Jeremy Flynn, who is the Vice President of Data Products and Strategy from Clear Channel Outdoor. We have Sherry Cram, who is the Associate Director of Data and Insights from Posterscope. James Price, the SVP Chief Product Officer at Outfront Media. Amit Shia, Vice President, Global Tech, Publisher, and Data Strategy from Prohaska Consulting. And Cheryl Zimmerman, the AVP of Sales Operations Services at Lamar Advertising. This group was instrumental in developing best practices around data analytics and a document that we shared earlier this spring with our membership. They're here today to talk a little bit about that document, how it came to be, why it's important, and why it's important for our industry to work collectively together to understand how best to represent and provide data to clients. So I'm going to turn it over to the data analytics chairman of our committee, James Price, who will start us off. Hi, James. Good morning, or good afternoon, I should say.
Good afternoon, Stephen. I wanted to start off by letting everybody know how the committee was formed and why it came about. The committee was formed because there were a lot of questions and opinions, information floating around in the out-of-home space relating to data. There wasn't really an industry voice on best practices. There wasn't a voice on how to use it properly or any kind of guidelines. So over the course of several months, we formed a committee, and the team undertook how to put different data and use cases into alignment. And we looked at it from every angle, from the publishers, the buyers, the consultants, those providing the services, and grew that team over time and built together, what we viewed as kind of a primer, if you would. What makes sense when, how to understand when being presented with data in a market or a solution in a market. Like I said, it's a primer, and we really focused on not being prescriptive. That was one of the questions that kept coming up is, are you going to be prescriptive and tell us exactly how to do it? And the answer is no. Everybody has their own needs depending on where you're at in the market and your own individual business strategies. We looked at everything from what makes out of home different, its relationship in the marketing funnel, to where marketers need data in that process, from planning and targeting and creative and measurement. And we really tried to follow ourselves along to see how the different data sources fit those needs and when they could be best applied. Really try to point the way. So it allowed the team to apply a checklist and a health grade, if you would, so that, data questions that to ask, understandably, we started from a non-prescriptive perspective, which made our focus on what exists, how it fits, when best to apply, and especially understand the output and how to compare that in media planning and for your own media. So, just to kind of round that out, we do anticipate this to be a living document. We understand that we're looking at a snapshot in time of what's available, how it can best be used. We look at this with the use cases as well that we have today, knowing that all that will change as time goes on. So, I really appreciate everybody's attendance today. Appreciate you listening in, and we'll appreciate your questions at the end. I'm going to turn it back to Stephen and the presenters as we walk through the documentation and go forward.
Thanks, James. So first we wanted to sort of have a conversation with Amit, who represents Prohaska. When we were developing this initiative, we wanted to get a consultant involved, someone who had a lot of experience with developing these types of standards and best practices and guidelines. So we went to Prohaska Consulting, who has done similar work with other trade groups, most notably IAB, and we thought they were the perfect partners to help us develop this document. So Amit and his team were instrumental in really fleshing out all the ideas that our committee brought forth and turned it into this concise piece of work. So Amit, tell us a little bit about the process and from your perspective, how this work aligns, with other work you've done with other channels.
Yeah. Stephen, thank you for that kind introduction, and folks, pleasure to join you, and really a privilege for us, Prohaska Consulting, and me personally to be involved with the initiative here with the OAAA and this broader committee. As we go through this today, and even thinking of the approach that brought us here and build upon James's themes, this is a powerful ecosystem, and it is hard to recognize all of the moving parts. And as we look at that, now our focus typically is programmatic based. How do we help media companies? How do we help buyers, sellers, and even the tech layer in the middle understand and transact, and what it takes to transact, look at the analytics, and turn this into a success story. And all of these elements come together. Part of this is science. And as we look at some of the data elements, part of this is an art form as well. And for marketers, especially as we look at this from the buy side, wanted to make sure that we answer the questions of how does this fit in? What we wanted to do, and as James mentioned, this isn't prescriptive. Everyone's needs are different, but creating a framework, a guideline, highlighting the opportunities that really exist, and how out-of-home plays a critical part in the overall buyer journey. When we look at the approach here and helping facilitate some of the efforts of the committee, this is taking inputs from over 30 different representatives. So many different companies involved, and those were from the marketer side, the agency side, the technology layers, different measurement providers in the middle, different platforms, as well as many inputs coming from the media companies represented. Taking those diverse thoughts, everyone with unique needs, and putting that in a way that adds value for every organization. So this is not a detailed level. This does not answer every question, but instead provides that framework. What is out of home as it relates to data and measurement? How can it be utilized? What's possible? Functionally starting the conversation so that marketers can realize there is a path here. This is a measurable environment. We often think of things, especially as we move more digitally oriented, of what are the units, what are the measures, how do we build and merge these data sets in, and taking some of those data inputs, how do we align that in the out-of-home framework? So providing that awareness of the different technologies that exist, how that can be applied, and a framework of how to move forward. Our hope, as we took all of the different feedback ideas, is there's so many different applications out there, and creating that common framework to understand how pieces come together. So what is the buy-side strategy? How does that translate into a measurement strategy? And then ultimately leading into attribution. And for each company, whether it's a media seller or a marketer looking to better understand audiences, data elements play a critical role there. So our takeaway is what's feasible, what's functional, that's background information, it's awareness of technology, and frankly, becoming that conversation starter between buyers and sellers on how do we best leverage the value of this medium, and more importantly, what are the data elements that will prove to effectiveness. We want to make sure that this vibrant industry gets the full recognition that it deserves, the contribution that it makes in the customer journey, and the impact to conversions, all of those of which can be proven. So with that, I know Jeremy, Sherry, and Cheryl are going to take us through more of the details, but pleasure to be a part of this, and appreciate any other input and feedback as we continue to evolve this document, as James mentioned, living and breathing longer term.
Thank you so much. I'm going to take you through a couple of the next slides. My name is Jeremy Flynn. Nice to meet everyone virtually. To James's point and Amit's point, this is a living and breathing document. We wanted to kind of set it up as a baseline. So what I would actually ask of all the folks who are taking time out of their day to day, if you see something that can make this document better, just share your feedback. This is our attempt as gathering as a group, starting to coalesce different industry perspectives. And this is our attempt at trying to help educate what we think is the current perspective on the use of data today in the out-of-home space. So I'll start off first by saying that this slide, which represents a marketing funnel, I think a lot of us marketers on the call today would also say that a funnel doesn't look like a funnel anymore. It actually looks like a life cycle, and I'll get into that in a bit. But the fun part about seeing a marketing funnel slide like this is the challenge that it represents in coming into out of home. So I think everyone on the call knows that out of home is really strong at driving brand awareness and being a really effective reach medium. But as we continue to innovate with attribution solutions and different measurement technologies, we are actually able to measure direct business and user outcomes as a result of being exposed to out of home. And so what we've been able to have conversations with brands and advertisers about is how they could start to measure different aspects of that customer journey, whether it be seeing an ad and taking on a specific behavior like going into a store location to ultimately purchasing a product or downloading an app. So we're trying to set the groundwork for that with the next couple of slides, and then I'll hand it off to my partner, Sherry. But if you want to go to the next slide, the core differences in out of home. So this is a question that I think constantly comes up for all of us. The fact is, out of home is a one-to-many medium. And oftentimes when discussed in the context of other media channels, we have to kind of remind the buy side or buyers of the out of home space who are not as familiar that, hey, this is an ad unit that reaches many, many people at once. And so the core differences in out of home with respect to audiences and formats and locations, to me, this slide represents a challenge in exposure methodology and how we can work with industry validated partners like Geopath to actually derive really strong exposure methodologies for all the different types of out-of-home ad units that could be sold. One of the more interesting ones lately is place-based. So understanding consumer movement in specific place-based locations, which is significantly different than driving 70 miles an hour on the highway. Another one could be fleet. We see an advent of new advertising technology for out of home where people put ad units on top of their cars and drive around. How do we actually effectively measure audiences that are seeing that? So this represents kind of our view on how exposure and a conservative approach to exposure will help set up all of the other things that we're going to talk about today in terms of audience planning, audience targeting, creative measurement, and ultimately getting into really interesting attribution approaches. So in moving to the next slide for planning, this is again where we actually really have a need for an independent third-party measurement approach that is a standardization of how impressions are counted for all different types of assets that could be on an out-of-home media plan. Being able to contextualize reach and frequency on a media plan allows for those media plans to be aligned with a full campaign that is planned by marketer and advertisers. And so what we really want to do is make sure that we're working with the best data sets that really help us qualify who's exposed to out-of-home advertising. So this could be relying on movement data sourced from mobile SDKs. It could be relied on reported data that is captured by a surveys. So the data for planning and the really good work that our friends at Geopath are doing to really help count who has the opportunity to see the advertising really kind of provides that foundation for planning really effective out-of-home campaigns that are reaching the right audience. You know, that oftentimes when I think about planning, I don't think about the physical location of the board, but rather the audience that is moving past the board. And so the more that we could do to contextualize that audience, the better. I don't know if you could hear my dog whining in the background, but he's just as excited about out-of-home planning as I am. Moving on to the next slide, data for targeting. So this is a really fun one. Marketers more than ever before are trusting data to help them inform their campaigns. And I think everyone on the leading the call today would be happy to report that the way to make more effective out-of-home campaigns today is to take the best practices that exist in digital for audience targeting and make those audiences available offline for targeting and profiling out-of-home inventory. And so what we mean by this slide, and again, each one of these slides could probably be its own hours long conversation. What we really mean to say with this slide is that brands and advertisers are relying on first and third party data that they could get access to via different data stores like LiveRamp to actually plan and reach a more effective audience. And so the ability for out-of-home advertisers and out-of-home media owners to actually incorporate those data-driven approaches to further enhance enhance and profile their media buy will become especially important. This is true not only for companies that make third-party data available, so thinking about like a Nielsen Catalina or an IRI that makes CPG audience segments available, but brands themselves that create their own internal custom audience segments. So this could be a fitness brand that has a CRM of known users that visit a gym. They have all of their information, and if in a privacy compliant way, they could see how those people are exposed to billboards, we could remind people to go to the gym, or we could remind people to remain loyal to specific brands. So targeting is definitely a really, really great innovative approach that I've seen kind of really start to kick up in the last 3 to 4 years. The next slide. This is, I think, a frontier for us. I think all of the time we all get asked about how we could optimize for creative on plans. And the first thing that I would say is there's so many best practices available today from folks who have been planning out-of-home campaigns for decades with respect to the amount of words that need to be on a billboard, the types of creative enhancements. But connecting that back to a data-driven approach, I think is going to become especially important, especially when we want out-of-home to play with other mediums. And so best practices like A/B testing is something that if we start to survey audiences when a campaign goes live, that's a way to actually measure the effectiveness of out-of-home, where you could then leverage really great out-of-home assets like digital out-of-home to swap to more higher performing creative. Also establishing really good pre-sale survey methodologies to really understand how consumer base responds to a creative before it goes live, also very, very key. So creative, I think, is definitely one to look out for. If you go to the next slide, data for measurement. Now, I think this is the really fun part because I think measurement has a different definition. James, I think you said this earlier, for everyone who you talk to. Each business is going to have their own way of defining what success means for their marketing campaign, which for us means we have to be extraordinarily flexible with what a brand and advertiser deems a success for an advertising campaign. And so the way that I think about measurement here is the difference between managed service measurement and self-service measurement, and the continuum for how we actually get brands and advertisers to lean into us for managed service measurement, where we are developing new measurement capabilities, like looking at app downloads, looking at people who are buying specific products, to having them do that work themselves. So the example that I like to use is the ride-sharing apps. The ride-sharing apps like Uber and Lyft have hundreds of data scientists that are doing measurement and research constantly. Being able to actually supply out-of-home exposure data to those folks for them to conduct their own measurement allows out-of-home to actually plug in to the different multi-touch or MMM models that they are maintaining for themselves to determine the effectiveness of out-of-home as a channel. Being able to do this for brands directly, but also for the agencies and the holding companies that we work with, really helps contextualize the value of out-of-home with respect to the other markets. And then I guess the last slide before I hand this back off to Sherry, if there could be a theme song, we would play the Lion King Circle of Life for this, but I'm going to relate this back to the first slide. The first slide is a funnel, right? And it's very linear. But really what the marketing journey is like today is more like this, which is how you could actually constantly be using data to best plan, refine, and reactivate your advertising program. And so if you're planning with data and you're measuring with data, you're creating learnings more frequently for yourself, and you're also establishing a baseline of those learnings to help push you in a direction for higher performing campaigns that will yield, as I said earlier, better user outcomes and better business outcomes. And so with that, appreciate the time today. I'm gonna hand it off to Sherry. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. So on to the next slide. So here we want to talk about the different considerations you should be thinking about before moving into any type of measurement, selecting methodology and whatnot. So here's 6, starting off with platform. So the first question you want to ask yourself is, are we looking at one unique medium, or are we trying to look at a cross-channel measurement? Next, ad formats. So are we looking at ad formats that are all comparable? Or is there something more of a mix, like a digital and a static animated video? Those all have unique ways of measuring their effectiveness. Next, methodology. So you want to think about what makes the most sense for determining the effectiveness of your campaign or whatnot. So here it could be geofencing, right? Determining if someone broke a geofence for an out-of-home unit, or are we doing something more of an intercept study? And then next, KPI. So I think this is the #1 thing here. Key performance indicators. What are you trying to achieve? What is going to validate this for you, for your client, for your team, whatnot? Are you looking at doing foot traffic, right? Is drive to store what's most important here? Is brand sentiment or recall? What's most important to you here? And that's really how you can start getting the ball rolling with measurement. Next, success criteria. So how is effectiveness counted and determined? Is this something that you're going to be sharing with a publisher or agency? And then finally, fidelity. So we'll dig into these a little bit more, but you want to think about the precision requirement, the frequency of data that you need, and the scale that would be inadequate for measurement. So on to the next slide. So there's a lot of different types of out-of-home executions, right? So as I mentioned in the last slide, ad formats play a huge role. If it's moving, if it's place-based, if it's a billboard. So we'll dive in a little bit about each one, broken out into the big four, the billboards, the street furniture, transit, place-based, and talk about the main considerations that you should have. These are not everything, but it's a good starting point, right? So talking about billboards, these are your typical large format, extended distances, right? So you could see it from a long way away. The industry terms that we're really familiar with are the bulletins, the junior posters, spectaculars. And some of the considerations here are field of view, how far can someone see it from? Signal accuracy, so is there a lot of clutter where you are? Time in view, right? If you're flying by, how often or how long can someone really see this? And then finally, font size, right? Can someone really see your message from specific distances? Next, we'll go into street furniture. So these are often a public amenity, so eye level or curbside for vehicular traffic, and often in close proximity to pedestrians. The industry terms we would know is transit shelters, newsstands, news racks, or kiosks. And then things to consider, they're highly directional, so I'm really good at telling you, go to the store and whatnot. They're a fixed location, which is really helpful for a geofence. And then there's potential for obstruction. So you really have to think about who can see it in the field of view that is able to view your furniture. Next, we look at transit. So these are really the moving vehicles, the transit terminals, as you would see there. The industry terminology we would know are the bus panels, the train, the rail, airport, taxi, mobile ads. And consideration here is short-term view, right? So a consumer is not looking at this for an extended period of time because it's something moving, and it's not a fixed location, which makes something like geofencing a little bit more difficult because there's not one spot that ad is going to be running on. And then finally, place-based. So these are the customized ad programs targeting specific audiences. We would know these as, arenas or stadiums, malls, in-store signage, gas station, businesses, movie theaters. And some of the considerations here is you need to really be in the immediate vicinity as a consumer to see the ad. So for measurement, you need to filter out the people who are not immediately adjacent to the screen. One big example of this would be, say in a movie theater, if your ad is towards the back of the whole area, you don't want to consider anybody who went to that theater as exposed, right? You want to make sure that it's customized to where that ad would be viewable. So into the next slide. So like we've spoken about, or Jeremy mentioned this, each one of these could be, an hour-long chat. So I'm going to do my best to kind of go through it and add some color, but certainly this will be available for you guys to read after. So what we want to talk about here is measurement fundamentals and identify how out-of-home is quite different from every other channel. In this example, we'll look at out-of-home versus digital versus broadcast measurement, and how all these different measurement types completely vary. So starting with exposure, what out-of-home really does what it comes down to is opportunity to see, as we've mentioned before. So users and proximity and presence of the media screen, did they have that chance to view it? For digital, it's a little different. So we're all familiar with the digital displays when you're going on a website. So an exposure is, it is on that page that a viewer is seeing. For broadcast, it's the average number of people who essentially have that television on with that exact channel on where the ad is running. Then when we jump to plays, so for out-of-home ad plays generated by media owners. So some ads, especially if it's digital, you might not be 100%. So there's definitely, you could be 1 of 8 flips, and that would be 1 play, right? For digital, we really see it as the number of times that ad showed up on your screen. And then for broadcast, it's actually the same as their exposure, the average number of people who had that TV program on, right channel, right time. Now looking at impressions. Oh, so we're still on. So looking at impressions, for out of home, it's pretty much the same as exposure, right? We're talking about the opportunity to see. Somebody is in that vicinity at the right time with the opportunity to be looking, right? Digital, it's identical to that exposure, right? Was that ad playing when you're on that website? And then same with broadcast, same as exposure. Was that ad playing when the TV was on at that right channel? Now going to accuracy. So this definitely from an out-of-home perspective can vary depending on the partner you use. So for out-of-home, we simply say it's the partner, it's the strength of their methodology. And that's something as we're going through, we could really help hone in on. But it depends on that, the specific partner that we're working with here. For digital and broadcast, the accuracy really is identified by matching to a device ID or an IP address. So understanding who that consumer is and being able to identify that. And then finally, sample size. So for out of home, we really have that question of, does the count of our survey or foot traffic, whatnot, accurately represent the population it's projected to? So does it translate to a proxy in the local market? For digital, they're really looking at number of people in a survey used for that analysis. And then for broadcast, it's the number of people included in the rating market is their sample. So on to the next slide. So now taking a little bit more of a dive into the methodology of the different kind of categories that we could be looking at. And we have here accuracy, precision, and scale. And you see it's on a range from, one actually says none, but typically we look at the poor to excellent. And definitely we can get more nitty-gritty into this, but I would say this is a really good overview. So if you have something where your client is saying the scale is the #1 thing I'm looking at here, this is just a guide to help you. But I'll really dig into the methodologies here, right? So carrier data. So that essentially is being connected to a network, right, on your mobile device. So you are signed in with a carrier and that carrier is able to connect you when you're trying to make a call, a text, use internet. The accuracy here is fair, and we would say precision is good. Kind of dependent on signal and where you are, the area you're in. But we say scale here is excellent. And that's because if you think about it, there's millions of people who opt into certain carriers. And they're able to get that data. So great scale there, bigger than most, right? GPS data, what this comes down to is the opt-in apps. And I'm sure everybody on here has gotten that message. You download an app and say, are you willing to share your location? If you opt in, yes, I'm willing to share my location at all times, you're part of this group, right? We're understanding where you move consistently throughout the day. The accuracy here is really good, and the precision could be good to excellent, again, depending on your signal, where you are and whatnot. However, the scale here is dependent on the SDK installs. And really what comes down to is what partner you're working with, right? So ideally, the partner that you're selecting for measurement has a lot of SDK integrations into a ton of different apps, which can get you great coverage. but that's something, you and that partner will be able to look at together to help determine the scale there. So now looking at bidstream. Bidstream really is that data call for an ad when you're in an app or in a website. So when your phone is open on an app and it says, I'm available for an ad, it's sending a location ping to that either mobile partner or who's ever the ad server at the time. We see here the only ones, so it's poor and none, right? Accuracy is poor and precision is none. One of the many reasons for this is there's a lot of clutter in this space, and also you're not necessarily getting ads consistently throughout your day. So really what we're getting is only a spot of where you were when that ad perhaps was open. So that kind of hinders that consumer journey a little bit. But the scale's good. There's mobile ads galore out there. So a lot of data to work with. Next, we're talking beacons. So this is really that Bluetooth technology that you need to have your Bluetooth turned on and visible, right? The accuracy and precision here are excellent. And one of the main reasons for that is the size, how big, broad the locations are, right? So here we have 10 to 100 feet, we can identify a consumer. So this is really good when you're walking into a store, it really picks up and knows that a consumer is walking right through. Again, for scale, dependent on SDK installs, it depends on if you have that turned on, what partners have beacons, and we'll dig into that in the next slide. Next is survey. So this comes down to users are answering questions to get your desired outcome. Accuracy and precision are pretty good here, right? We can ask consumers where they are when they were there, but the scale is pretty poor. Main reason for that is these are opt-in consumers to taking a survey. So that's not every consumer out there, not every consumer with a device is open to taking a survey. Next, we move to point of sale. So this is having data at specific retailers that share when a purchase is made. So accuracy, are excellent, and precision is excellent. And the reason why is we know where and when that purchase was made, which is very strong. However, the scale is fair. Not every retailer is opted into this, and not everything is measurable. And then finally on this slide, we have camera sensor. So uses anonymous vision algorithms to analyze users passing an out-of-home unit. The accuracy is good to excellent and the precision is good. There's a lot of great innovation in this space. However, the scale is dependent on sensor installs, which we'll get into. It's similar to beacons. It has to physically be placed. So depends on how many are there, right? So moving on to the next slide. Great, so now we're gonna talk, we've touched on a few of these, but these are the main types of collection methodologies. And we'll dig a little bit into the advantages and considerations, right? They all have their strengths and they all have their weaknesses, or, things that you need to put a little bit more thought into for the overall. So start with panel-based. We were just talking about surveys, right? So accuracy is great, precision, we can really understand when and where a consumer was, and depth of information is strong. Depending on the partner you work with, you can ask a plethora of questions and really understand things from consumer mindset to recall to intentions. However, some things to consider here are sample size of panel limits the cuts of data. So if you're trying to understand the difference between markets or formats or demographic cuts, you need to up your sample size, and that's not always possible here. So just something to think about. Also, delay in analysis from panel response. You really want to get that consumer almost immediately after exposure, if not within that 24-hour period, because consumers might not remember, right? You want to get them right after exposure. Now going to Wi-Fi, which is really strong for footfall. Accuracy here is great, broad range, scale. Wi-Fi is everywhere, broadly available, right? And it's ongoing, so it's constantly making that tracking. Things to consider is accuracy is not as precise for a subset of locations due to range being 300 feet. Right? Now going to GPS, we spoke about this a little bit too. Great for footfall. The accuracy is strong, it's ongoing, right? We're understanding that consumer journey because a lot of consumers are saying, feel free to track my location all day, right? However, some considerations are scale might be limited due to opt-in. Like I mentioned, you have to physically say, yep, track my location. And two, frequency of location updates may be limited by device settings. So it's kind of up to the consumer, right? Are they open to sharing their location all day or only when the app is active? So it just limits that a little bit. Now into beacons. So again, great for looking at footfall. Accuracy is great. It was within that 10 to 100 feet radius, really precise there. And directional configuration and data capture, right? You're in that small zone and we know you're there. But things to consider, beacons have a cost, right? They are physical structures that need to be added. So, right, it requires a physical installation at a board or retail location. And it also requires an app to read the beacon signal. Someone has to have that Bluetooth turned on. Device tracking. So associating the actions of a specific user to media viewed. So this goes back to kind of in my first slide where we're talking about, we're looking at cross-channel. Are we trying to see out of home plus mobile exposure? Are we looking at, did someone end up on a website after being exposed to your ad? Really great opportunities there, but there are some limitations, right? So the cookies are slowly slipping away as we read constantly. And then also industry actions decreasing access to device identifiers. I'm sure we've all heard that Apple is starting to limit the data that you could receive from a device. And with CCPA, you know, consumer privacy is really prevalent right now. So it's making it a little bit more tricky to follow that consumer journey across multiple devices. Next, we go into point of sale, so that purchase data. So mentioning before, it's that high precision because we know where and when that purchase was made. However, there's limited range and lacking access to 100% of retail footprint. So for example, if you're a CPG product, there's a ton of places that your product could be purchased, and one point of sale partner might not have access to every retail location. So you are looking at a portion of those sales, just important to keep in mind. And then finally, the camera sensor. So really great accuracy because you're within that short range, it's ongoing, it's constantly tracking, and you don't need to opt in, right? So no consumer has to say yay or nay to that. However, consideration, it requires a physical installation of sensors in the vicinity of the screen. So again, not necessarily something you could snap your fingers like a geofence and have turned on. So that's my section, and happy to pass on over to Cheryl.
Okay, thank you. I'm Cheryl Zimmerman again, and it's been really fun to participate in these discussions. And especially for me, I come from a perspective of more of data and sales enablement, and slightly less of a technical skill set than some of the partners on this call. So this has been a really interesting project. But whether you feel like it's in your wheelhouse or not, at this point, I feel like it's important for all of us to accept the role of being consumers of measurement data. And what you're looking at here is a guide to better understanding what comprises the data set that you're evaluating. And I really like that it's laid out in the familiar grid of a nutrition facts type of a label that you'd see at the grocery store. And what I really like about this part of the document is that it demystifies the process for someone like me who never originally trained to be a data specialist, but you must, and who may feel like evaluating and comparing data sets and different providers for the first time would be very intimidating if you don't know the right questions to ask. So really, I feel like what this boils down to is a very handy cheat sheet layout of all of the data criteria Sherry just very carefully reviewed for us. But it's got very helpful examples and descriptions of what you're looking for in response in the right column. And these are things that you should be asking your data provider to be sure that the methodology and the relevance of their particular data that you're evaluating is going to align with your campaign goals. You want to make, what's really important here is that you know the right questions to ask so that you're not horribly disappointed at the end to find out that what you're using to measure your campaign success can't really report what you were looking for to begin with. It's really about managing expectations to me. And to me, that's why these questions are so important to ask. And I think the most important part about understanding what comprises a particular data source compared to another is gaining some awareness and also sometimes being okay with how they're different before you're getting started so that your expectations are realistic. So for example, it's not unusual at all to plan an out-of-home campaign using one set of location data or maybe geopath impressions to plan to reach a predicted target audience with an out-of-home campaign, but then report attribution with a different set of survey panel data to determine a lift in product awareness after the campaign. So one data set isn't right or wrong compared to the other. They just report different things and they accomplish different goals based on their strengths. So the kinds of questions you should be asking are, what is the sample size? Like Sherry went into detail of the location data that you're using. If it's location data, what is the accuracy of that data? How do you validate this data in order to ensure that it's accurate and it's representative of a full population? How do you collect this data? How often do you update it? And then in the next slide, while that neat and tidy nutrition label guide gives us an easy checklist to better understand what comprises your selected data source, it's just as important to carefully consider what nuances about it are very important to your particular campaign's success or to your advertisers' goals. So what you're looking at here is a great list of suggested questions to consider based on your campaign's measurement needs. So here's an example. Let's say that your customer is going to need to monitor campaign results periodically during their campaign. So general consideration questions like being able to access the data in real time, and maybe a methodology consideration question like understanding the frequency that that data is going to be updated so that you can access it on a routine schedule are really important in being able to manage that expectation. Or if you had more technical needs, let's say that I needed to report foot traffic to a QSR location resulting from my out-of-home campaign. So in order to make sure that I'm not going to be picking up out-of-home traffic that's passing by my out-of-home ad that was already on the way to that store location, I need to get clarity from a technical consideration about how the provider accounts for this location bias. Because the reason why I need to make sure that I understand that is so that I'm only reporting the lift of additional store visits that were truly a result of my campaign and not just activity that would have passed by and been going in that direction anyway. And then finally, when you're interrogating data and trying to consider out-of-home's contribution to the success of your advertiser's campaign, there are some really important questions that you need to keep in the back of your mind. And first, how does out-of-home compare to other media? So all buyers and sellers and all partners of the out-of-home industry need to be considering how the data and measurement that we use demonstrates how out-of-home adds value to the media mix model. And understanding which form of data makes a very compelling value proposition for out-of-home. It could be standard impressions measurement, or it could be based on data that tracks an actionable result, like footfall that's critical to the campaign goals. Predictive data like our impressions are fundamental to planning out-of-home as part of an overall campaign, but validating the success of the campaign is really just as critical at this point. Validation or our attribution measurement can be data collected on whatever the desired outcome is. And it could be anything from visits to a store location or a website, or the intention to watch a TV show that was advertised on out-of-home locations. Also, what are the right data sets to measure out-of-home? Location data has come a long way from our old traffic circulation counts, and being able to tap into trip behaviors at the mobile device level really opens the doors to more than just understanding who the out-of-home audience is and where they come from. But location data is giving our whole industry the ability to be able to tell a really interesting story that can help optimize multi-touch attribution efforts in a really non-invasive way within the out-of-home ecosystem. And what I mean when I say that is, think about this. If a consumer lives in a bedroom community outside of a major metro area, and so they drive into the station and they're passing billboards along the way, and then they're exposed to station and transit advertising, and then on a walk to work they encounter street furniture and maybe place-based. On the drive back home they encounter more out of home, and that could include place-based advertising when they're even stopping for gas. And this is just a hypothetical example of an out of home journey, but it's a great example of the kind of story that we can tell about our audience using this type of location data, because it's the behavior and the journey that really is a relevant story to be able to tell our customers. How does out of home compare value with other media? Out of home is really fortunate that due to the nature of our products, we just don't have to deal with issues like viewability or fraud. Location data also gives us some really robust information to help us plan campaigns more accurately around our desired target audiences. But it also gives us the ability to report how we can more effectively interact with that audience compared to mobile or online. So, you know, think about this, a mobile device ID and our location data for our out-of-home audience is sitting at a red light facing a billboard, or it's waiting in a bus shelter. And that mobile device ID, which represents our audience, is going to have an ad exposure for much longer duration or much longer dwell time being exposed to that out-of-home ad than while scrolling through a website. How can out-of-home more effectively target audiences? When you're considering what measurement to use, it's got to be aligned with what you're calling the target audience. So what I mean by that is if it's a standard demographic that correlates very nicely with forecast and impressions measurement, like what we pull from Geopath, that works in a lot of out-of-home plans. But I think what's becoming more attractive is finding additional data to answer our advertisers' demands for reaching consumers with very specific behaviors or purchase habits. So for instance, let's say I have a customer that has their own DMP and they've collected their own marketing and audience data, and they want to effectively plan around the trip behaviors of these specific device IDs with an out-of-home campaign. All of us in the out-of-home industry need to be able to be constantly striving to work with platform and data partners in order to be able to turn around a media plan based around any given first or third party data that comes our way. And I believe that should be our goal moving forward in terms of just continuously improving on how we accurately target audiences and align ourselves with the rest of the media mix model. Is out-of-home privacy compliant? This is kind of an easy one. The out-of-home product line is really by nature a one-to-many medium. So unlike one-to-one digital, online, and mobile, intrusive and personal data, it just really has no place in measuring and reporting the effectiveness of an out-of-home campaign. So everything that we're talking about in this call is regarding anonymized and aggregated audience data to reach large quantities of audiences with campaigns, like large scale out of home campaigns. And we're not talking about just one personal screen. So, I mean, but that said, we all are approached by data providers on a regular basis, and we all have a responsibility to refer to the OAAA privacy guidelines to make sure that we're partnering with responsible players at all times. And finally, how can attribution metrics be incorporated? In a perfect world, we would love to be able to forecast and plan all of our out-of-home campaigns using the same audience data that we then turn around and use to report attribution and prove the campaign success based around the original plan that we forecasted. But of course, it's not a perfect world. And I don't think that there's such thing as a one-size-fits-all solution, at least not yet. And I also think that this particular area is going to be a never-ending learning experience, and I don't think that that's a problem. I think a constant state of experimenting is definitely good for this industry, and as an industry, we should be embracing that. And I also think that there's no cookie cutter solution because every advertiser's needs are different, and the options available to us as an industry continue to grow in terms of being able to match up data from the attribution results to data we've used to plan. One of the great things I think about this document is that it basically points us in the right direction in terms of guidelines and understanding the right questions to ask, because the end result or the expected result from an out-of-home campaign you're trying to plan is always going to be a little bit different. Let me stop my monologue about these questions. And James, I'm curious what you think and what your perspective is, just in terms of the theory that it can't all be the same because advertisers' needs are always going to be different.
Yeah, I'll jump in. One of the things you've heard, and I'll jump in from this perspective, one of the things you've heard throughout the entire, panel presentation is it isn't one size fits all. That understanding the needs of your client is paramount, that understanding how data can meet those needs and the different types of data, and most especially the application of it, right? Am I it's not necessarily that you have a right or wrong data source, it's does it get the job done necessary to appropriately explain value to the client and show the value that out-of-home has, right? A lot of digital media today, if you've heard me speak on panels before, I'll tell you, people like wrapping themselves up in a warm little blanket of data and feeling good about clicks and impressions and interactions, and everybody just feels real happy about it. And there's nothing wrong with that. But we can't forget that entire buy cycle that started with what Amit showed, that walked through how to use data properly based on what stage of the cycle you're in, that Jeremy showed, that goes to the proper source and application of the data that Sherry showed, and to understand the application of it, as to meet the client goals with those questions that Cheryl went through. When you tie it all together, there's not a good or bad, there's am I applying the information correctly to meet the needs of my client to show value? And that's really the only question you have to answer at the end of the day, is did it get the job done properly and not misstate, anything, or accidentally lend someone to something that they shouldn't have gathered out of it. Hopefully it's helpful to think of it that way. It's not prescriptive. It's not a formula that you can perfectly follow because every client wants something different. It also gives us a chance to say things to clients that they may not have considered. I remember being in a conversation with someone where they were like, I'm advertising, it was a clothing brand. And the clothing brand was talking about, I want to target, males between the ages of A and B. And, I said, you know what, guys, I said, quite frankly, what about a significant other for that male? Is it the male that has to go out and buy the shirt, or is the significant other going to go out and buy the shirt? And it was like, wait a minute, I hadn't thought about that. Well, let's think about who's actually doing the buying. Let's think about the journey pattern of the purchase. Now let's think about who you want to expose it to. Now let's get into the creative messaging. Maybe you have an A/B test, right? Or you do targeting for males versus females, or, households with significant others, that kind of thing. It allows us to expand the conversation in ways that you don't normally get allowed to have a conversation about. It takes you to the strategic table. So, I don't want to get up on a soapbox. The guys on the committee, I'll tell you, this committee was probably the best I've ever been on in my life, because you ended up with such a collegial and respectful arena of discussion, not argument, arena of discussion about how things work and should work and where the opportunities are, that I frankly enjoyed it more than anything. When we got together, I was always excited. I know we have a few minutes left. We got a couple of Q&A questions. Stephen, is this the proper time?
Yeah. And I do want to jump on that, James, and say again, thanks to this group in particular. This was part of the core group that really worked for almost 9 months to make this project happen and this paper happen. And I think, as James mentioned earlier, we actually had a broader group of almost 30 people who got together on a town hall to really help us kick the tires and make sure we were understanding really how this document needed to work for everybody within the out-of-home ecosystem. And the other point I think I'll make here, if I might, is that this is a really great document, because I think it will help navigate the industry and those people who are interested in our industry to understand how to sort of deal with the huge volume of data that we're seeing. There are lots of data companies out there, providers to our industry today, providing really great data. And a real value of this document is also to help users of the data understand, if they're going to work with these different media data companies, sort of how you need to approach them or what you need to ask from them, so that at the end of the day, you're getting sort of a common approach to the data, regardless of what type of data it is or the data company. You're at least creating a ground set or some sort of guide rails in terms of how the data should be provided to you as the end user. So I think that's all really valuable stuff. We do have a couple of quick questions, quite a number, but let me ask a couple of the group, because these are important. One, and this is a great question: if California voters approve another privacy measure this fall, could that impact the goal in advertising for using data to better match messaging to audiences?
Even I can take that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ken, great question, and certainly California among the first in the United States following along GDPR, but we're going to see this, and there's already efforts underway with 20 some odd states, and eventually this will move to a federal level. That would be our expectation, but it will limit the amount of data that ultimately comes in. That being said, there are industry associations looking at this, one being the IAB. REARC is their initiative, where things are going to change. This is going to be opt-in. There will be permission-based. So the entire model is really going to change over the long term. So things will go away. Users will have more control. There will be alternate methods that have come in. What we will start to see, and this really won't affect digital out-of-home as much as it will other aspects of the ecosystem, are you'll authenticate in different environments and permission your data to be used in certain applications. So long term, yes, it'll change the methodology, but not a severe impact as it relates to out-of-home from a privacy compliance way. May change some access to data. Some amount of data will go away, but the ecosystem will still be able to thrive, and there will still be a ample amount of data to be able to build models of, just different than what's in place today.
Oh, and that's a good. And then that follow-up question to that would be, if mobile IDs are phased out, what other sort of approaches to identification might be used to replace it? Any thoughts on that at this point, or is it too early?
It's still too early, but yes, just like third-party cookies, which will start to the demise of the third-party cookie, and we've already seen that on Safari and Google Chrome now, which in 18 months. Will go away. Mobile IDs will follow a similar path. So again, there are efforts underway to look at new options. Email, we may start authenticating it in certain environment. There'll be a trade-off in maybe perhaps the content that you can receive versus what you might be able to access. So more of this is more so digitally website oriented than what we may see here from a out-of-home perspective. Obviously, the data elements align. So new industry initiatives underway. What is the right method to do that? There will be something different than mobile IDs, but we would still expect functionality to remain.
Great, thank you. Well, listen, we're at 1 o'clock. Thank you to this great panel for your insights today, and again for your help in developing this work product over the last several months. I do want to remind everyone that you will receive a link after the webinar asking you to take a brief survey. We'd appreciate if you would do that. Also later today, a recording of this webinar will be available on the OAAA website in the Lunch Break Series library. So we do encourage you to go back and listen to it again if you wanted to continue to think about the topics or share it with your colleagues and friends. And finally, we have a great webinar next week, one on digital out of home. OAAA commissioned Nielsen to produce 2 digital out of home studies, which have been completed, and we'll be talking about those next week. So again, thanks everyone for joining us, and have a great afternoon.